Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Goemon's Great Adventure, otherwise known as Mystical Ninja 2, Starring Goemon, a side-scrolling action platformer title developed and published by Konami for the Nintendo 64 back in 1998. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 105, and it is another special episode because this is another Patreon-sponsored episode, this one by ISO. ISO did record a message for everybody to listen to, so ISO, take it away.
Purazima! Hi, this is ISO. This is my sponsor message for Mystical Ninja 2, Starring Goemon. If nobody's ever heard of this one, it's probably because it's a pretty obscure game, I'd imagine. I remember getting this game for Christmas one year. We'd had our Nintendo 64 stolen probably a couple of months previously, and we were our grandparents gave us a couple of games to bolster our collection from which was stolen. One was Snowboard Kids, another classic which I'm sure will probably show up on the CGT list. The other one was Mystical Ninja 2. Remember when we got it, I had no idea what it was. I remember even saying to my brother, I don't know what this game is. I don't understand. And we looked through the manual, read it cover to cover, and then we just started playing it, and this game is so unique and very Japanese. So I look forward to Tony reviewing this, because I remember a lot of culture shock when it came to this game. And it's a funny game because when we moved back down to our hometown, we we had this game for years, and then we sort of came back to it, and turns out our best friends, me and my brother's best friends, had this game as well, and we would play it constantly. We'd stay up all hours of the night trying to wait for the magic bus and all these magical little moments, which if you ever play the game, you'll see there's so many little quirky mistranslations and stuff, like I will now deprive you of all your hats is still said commonly in our group. You guys have got to just play this game for the death screen, which I think is one of the best in gaming. It's devils hula hooping, which is just insane. And if you tap A, they hula hoop faster. But yeah, this game's got so many cool different things, like you replay levels based on missions that you get, and it's really unique, and I feel like it was really ahead of its time. I'd love to dedicate this episode to my brother Ross, my best mate Michael, and his brother Davidoff. I hope you guys listen to this episode and know how much this game means to me because of the memories that we made together waiting for the magic bus. And everybody else, just remember Plasma. And Tony, if you feel up to it, if you could give me your best plasma, it would be really appreciated. Much love.
Thank you, ISO, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. Oh, and also, Purasuma! Anyway, if you would like to sponsor an episode or just get in touch with me to talk about classic games or technology or pretty much anything in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It's all out there. I highly encourage everyone to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I cannot recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day, and that is Mystical Ninja 2, Starring Goemon. Goemon's Great Adventure, or Mystical Ninja 2 Starring Goemon, depending on where in the world you live, is a side-scrolling action platformer title developed and published by Konami for the Nintendo 64 back in 1998. Before we can talk about Mystical Ninja 2, we have to take a step back and dive into the history behind the character Goemon in general. Because, unlike many video game protagonists, Goemon didn't originate as a bunch of ones and zeros inside a computer program. Instead, Goemon began his life in 16th century feudal Japan, and more specifically in 1558, which is when Ishikawa Goemon, the mythological Japanese anti-authoritarian figure, was officially born. The story around Goemon the man is one that mimics the folklore and legends of other cultures across the world, and depending on who you talk to or what reference material you read, Goemon might be presented in one of several different ways. Some stories tell of Goemon's early childhood as the son of a noble samurai. In this version of Goemon's origin story, his father would be killed by the Ashikaga shogunate, Japan's feudal military government of the 1500s, and Goemon would take it upon himself to vow revenge on his father's killers. From that point on, he would dedicate himself to the study of ninjutsu martial arts, becoming a ninja who would strike his enemies from the cover of darkness, a constant avenging angel in the shadows who would strike fear into the hearts of those who wronged him. Another version of the Goemon story portrays him as a famed assassin who would be instructed to kill some very high-ranking members of Japanese society, including a failed attempt on Oda Nobunaga, the legendary Japanese figure who sought to unify the clans of Japan under a single warlord, thereby creating a truly integrated nation. Still, other tales would depict Goemon as the leader of a band of noble thieves who would steal from the rich and distribute their stolen goods to the needy and impoverished, a sort of feudal Japanese Robin Hood figure. Other tales would tell of Goemon's romantic exploits, where he'd be forced to flee his provincial home because of an indiscretion with his master's mistress that effectively led to his excommunication from his home. Even the circumstances around his eventual death is one shrouded in doubt, with one of the more popular stories being that he was boiled alive on the banks of the Kamo River in Kyoto, Japan, following a failed assassination attempt on the legendary samurai Toyotomi Hideyoshi, which itself was a revenge-fueled mission to avenge the death of Goemon's wife and the kidnapping of his son. Regardless of which of those stories, if any, are true, the fact is that the legend of Goemon would grow over time, and shortly after his death, which is widely believed to have occurred in late 1594 at the age of 36, a number of playwrights and authors would begin to both document his mythical exploits as well as dramatize his life, which would result in the creation of a number of kabuki plays and other dramatic performances in which Goemon would be portrayed as a folk hero to the Japanese populace, a portrayal that would persist for literally hundreds of years following his death. As with any legend or folklore, as time passed, more and more depictions of Goemon's life would embed themselves into the cultural fabric of society, including the creation of books, plays, movies, and other media that served to keep the myth of Goemon's life alive and well in Japan pop culture, even into more modern times. Over the 4 centuries following Goemon's life and death, there would be countless depictions of the man behind the myth, including portrayals as a tragic villain, a brawny bandit with a heart of gold, and an athletic, slender ninja with vengeance in his heart. Regardless of how Goemon was portrayed, the Japanese public ate those portrayals up, and it wouldn't take long before creative individuals began to think about whether Goemon could potentially make his way into the digital realm, to allow individuals to control his exploits directly, rather than watching them play out on the silver screen, or reading about them in a book, or observing actors act them out on a raised stage. And when we think about the early video game industry, especially the period of time in the early 80s when video and arcade games were rapidly gaining prominence and popularity across the globe, perhaps no other company was better suited to translate Goemon's exploits into digital form than the legendary game development studio and publisher, Konami. Konami was originally founded in 1969 as a jukebox rental and repair business in Osaka, Japan, before shifting its focus in the 1970s to become more of a video game development studio. Spurred on by rapid advances in technology and the potentially lucrative opportunities that the burgeoning video game market held, Konami would pivot away from the music and jukebox industry and turn its attention squarely on the new frontier of video game development, releasing its first arcade title in 1977, a breakout clone entitled Block Yard. Within the next year, Konami would begin working on a number of other arcade titles, and would further begin to export those games to America and other geographic regions around the globe, in an attempt to both make a name for itself, as well as garner as much profit as possible from their early coin-operated efforts. It didn't take long before Konami began to be recognized as a quality video game developer, and by the early 80s, Konami had become one of the most well-respected arcade game development studios in the world, with classics like Frogger, Track and Field, and Bionic Commando predecessor Rock and Rope becoming mainstays in arcades around the world. As the mid-80s approached, Konami recognized the need to begin diversifying their video game development efforts, and decided to expand beyond the arcade market to include the creation of titles for home consoles. While Konami did have a brief stint creating games for the Atari 2600 back in 1982, that effort was short-lived, as just 1 year later, Atari would be pushed to the brink of collapse following a continuous influx of subpar gaming experiences that eroded consumer confidence in the home video game market, especially in North America. Konami, for its part, would pivot away from Atari and would instead focus on the Japanese-centric MSX computer platform, as well as the Nintendo Famicom console, a partnership that would prove to be one of the most successful ventures for Konami as a company to date. During the time period when Konami was partnering with Nintendo, a number of new franchises would be created, some of which would span the arcade and home console markets, like famed side-scrolling action platformer Contra and the vehicular side-scrolling shooter Gradius, while others would be home console exclusives, like the incredibly popular vampire title Castlevania. Across Konami's entire portfolio of games, they had a pretty strong mix of original intellectual property combined with a number of titles that were inspired, at least in part, by pop cultural trends of the time. As an example, Contra, while ostensibly an original title born in the minds of Konami developers, was in fact heavily inspired by both H.R. Giger's artwork as well as popular action stars and films of the 80s, most notably those starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Castlevania, the Dracula Whip-a-thon that would eventually spawn a series of games with over 30 individual titles, was itself based on both traditional vampiric folklore as well as the Universal Pictures creature feature films of the 1930s and 40s, and Castlevania would borrow liberally from both sources to inform the creation of its game world and the enemies that players would face as they'd play the game. While these influences were predominantly taken from Western culture, that didn't mean that Konami wasn't also looking at their own Japanese culture as a means of inspiration for future titles, which is exactly why, in 1986, the mythical Goemon figure from Japanese folklore would be chosen to get his very first video game, the Japan-exclusive arcade title, Mr. Goemon. Mr. Goemon would feature side-scrolling action platformer gameplay, with players being given control of the titular Goemon and tasked with jumping and fighting their way through 4 stages, each of which would contain a number of enemies, items to pick up and throw at foes, and boss fights to truly test your skills. The environments in the game, while limited by graphics processing power of the time, all very clearly showed their Japanese cultural inspirations, with stages depicting the Japan countryside and flora, traditional Japanese homes, temples, and buildings, and various other Japan-centric references that might feel out of place in an international release, but were absolutely perfect as a Japan-exclusive title, and Japanese arcade-goers of the time ate it up, as Mr. Goemon would become one of the highest-grossing Japanese arcade titles released in 1986, an indicator that perhaps the Goemon folklore might be a good fit for future video game titles. Konami would follow up its Mr. Goemon arcade title with the home console Goemon release for the Nintendo Famicom and MSX computer platform, entitled Ganbare Goemon Karakuri Doshu. This game would feature Goemon as a noble thief exploring the Japanese countryside with a mix of side-scrolling action gameplay coupled with first-person exploration, where your goal was to make your way through a series of stages, collecting 3 passes throughout each individual stage before being allowed to progress to the next stage. These passes, interestingly, were not necessarily the easiest to find, as some were hidden while others were available for purchase from various merchants that might dot the landscape in a given stage. Once all 3 passes were acquired, players could then move on to the next stage, and if they completed all of the stages in the game, they would be allowed to progress to the next Japanese province, which featured a step up in difficulty, but otherwise included identical stages to the prior province you would have just completed. This would continue until you completed all 8 of the game's provinces, which would reward you with a special ending for persevering through the game's ever-increasing difficulty levels. With the release of Ganbare Goemon Karakuri Doshu, the Goemon mythos was now a true game series, which as a collection of games would take on the moniker Ganbare Goemon. Since Mr. Goemon's release in 1986, the Ganbare Goemon series would feature a ridiculous number of Goemon games making their way to nearly every console and platform on the market, with the majority being Japanese exclusive, owing largely to the fact that the Goemon legend was not nearly as well known outside of Japan pop culture. Despite the Japan-centric nature of the folklore surrounding Goemon, there were several efforts to bring Goemon titles to a broader international market, with the first Goemon game released outside of Japan being The Legend of the Mystical Ninja, a Super Nintendo title originally released back in 1991. The Legend of the Mystical Ninja was the 5th title in the overall Ganbare Goemon series, and like I mentioned, the first released outside of Japan. In the game, players control either Goemon or frequent companion Ebisumaru, 2 martial arts adventurers who set off on a side-scrolling, action platforming-based quest across various Japan landmarks and locations. Unlike other Goemon titles of the time, The Legend of the Mystical Ninja would be the first to appear on a 16-bit console, and the additional power provided by Nintendo's Super Nintendo was used to great effect here, with updated graphics, deeper gameplay, a full power progression system, and a variety of arcade-styled minigames that served to make Legend of the Mystical Ninja Goemon's biggest adventure yet. It was also, by all accounts, Goemon's best adventure yet, as gamers and critics alike would praise the game's mix of RPG and side-scrolling action gameplay, along with the overall quality of the visuals and the outstanding Japan-styled music. A number of publications would name Legend of the Mystical Ninja to be one of the best Super Nintendo games ever made, and some have even claimed it to be one of the better action platforming titles ever to be released, a testament to the quality of Konami's work and an indication that despite the Japan-centric roots of the game, it still had a mass-market worldwide appeal. With such a response, you would expect there to be an eventual sequel, and here you would be 100% right, as Legend of the Mystical Ninja would receive 3 direct 16-bit sequels, with each one rated even higher than the last by many critics, as the gameplay of the series would continue to be refined and honed to a razor-sharp edge of awesomeness. Interestingly though, despite the quality of the titles, and despite the fact that The Legend of the Mystical Ninja was a successful international release, each of its 3 direct sequels would once again only release in Japan, a decision that I don't know the true reason behind, as it certainly seems that not releasing those titles more broadly would have a negative impact on potential sales, especially considering the quality of each game. My assumption is that the localization effort would have been more costly than the perceived benefit from an international release, but that is purely me conjecturing. Regardless, after The Legend of the Mystical Ninja, Goemon's exploits would remain as Japan-exclusive adventures until 1997, which is when Mystical Ninja Starring Goemon would release in Japan, North America, and Europe for the Nintendo 64 console. With the shift to Nintendo's newest and most powerful console, Mystical Ninja Starring Goemon would feature brand new gameplay that had never been possible in a Goemon adventure before, as Konami decided to jump on the 3-dimensional bandwagon and deliver a 3D pseudo-open-world action platforming adventure with a mix of combat, exploration, and RPG elements similar to its predecessors, but dramatically improved visuals and audio, and expanded gameplay mechanics made possible by the Nintendo 64's more advanced hardware, including its brand new analog controller designed to allow for easier exploration of 3D spaces than traditional digital control pads. Konami, for its part, really believed in their new 64-bit Goemon adventure, so much so that they made the decision early on to design the game to utilize 128 megabit cartridges, more storage than any other Nintendo 64 game released up to that point. To put that storage size into perspective, Nintendo's legendary Super Mario 64 shipped on 64 megabit cartridges, and GoldenEye 007, Rare's first-person shooter classic, shipped on 96 megabit cartridges. With Mystical Ninja Starring Goemon, Konami was banking on creating an even bigger, better adventure than many of its peers, both figuratively and literally. One of the reasons Konami decided to use 128 megabit cartridges was the fact that they wanted to create an experience with an expanded, high-quality audio environment. As many may be aware, even with the Nintendo 64's expanded technical capabilities in comparison to its 16-bit ancestors, using digital pre-recorded audio of any kind in Nintendo 64 games was not a typical occurrence. Most of the time, you'd have synthesized music using wavetable samples specific to each game's soundtrack, and most spoken word audio was limited to one-liners or other short snippets of speech. With Mystical Ninja, Konami wanted to use pre-recorded audio, with 3 full-fledged digital songs included, as well as a number of voice-acted dialogue, which was intended to add additional depth and immersion to the overall experience. Sure, even with the 128 megabit cartridge, the game couldn't compete with the storage provided by CD-based consoles like the Sony PlayStation, but that didn't stop Konami from including a high-quality soundtrack and pre-recorded dialogue, along with an expansive 3D texture-mapped world, 4 different characters for players to control, and a number of different environments, enemies, and non-player characters to interact with. Konami had high hopes for Goemon's Nintendo 64 debut, but unfortunately, it wouldn't be quite as widely beloved as prior Goemon titles. While many praised the game's quirky Japan-inspired visuals, story, and high-quality audio and graphics, some reviewers complained that the game had some gameplay issues and wasn't nearly as smooth to play as titles like Mario 64, with the in-game camera often cited as a frustration that could cause players to lose focus on Goemon and his allies, and subsequently make the whole experience less fun to play. Critics recognized there was goodness here, and it wasn't like the game was panned. It just wasn't considered a runaway success, especially in comparison to its predecessors. The transition to 3D gameplay was not received as well as Konami had hoped, and as they began to plan out their next Goemon adventure, they knew they would have to go back to the drawing board to deliver the kind of experience that they knew players expected from their Goemon series. So, as Konami started working on Mystical Ninja's inevitable sequel, they decided to go back to their roots and return Goemon to a more two-dimensional platforming style, a major stylistic shift that would make the game dramatically different than the majority of the Nintendo 64 game library. We've spoken about this in prior episodes, but just to refresh everyone's memory, the Nintendo 64 was a console designed from the ground up to deliver cutting-edge, for the time, 3D experiences, and the majority of games released for the console were created to leverage the Nintendo 64's 3D capabilities, with certain landmark titles like Mario 64 providing a framework for other developers to mimic and hopefully enhance for their own titles. Despite the technical capabilities of the system, the actual 3D gameplay of many Nintendo 64 titles was lacking, driven primarily by the fact that developers hadn't yet really figured out how to deliver engaging three-dimensional movement, exploration, and combat. Everyone was effectively learning as they went, and while certain experiments would prove successful and pave the way for the 3D controls and mechanics we all know and love today, like Ocarina of Time's Z-targeting system, others would be much less well received. With Mystical Ninja Starring Goemon, Konami attempted to deliver a fully 3D adventure, but ultimately fell short. With Mystical Ninja 2, Konami resolved to return to their two-dimensional platforming roots, mixed in with a dash of advanced three-dimensional world building to deliver a hybrid 2.5D experience that would be unlike nearly any other title released on the Nintendo 64 to date. Mystical Ninja 2 would be designed to take advantage of the 3D capabilities of the Nintendo 64, but unlike many Nintendo 64 3D titles, wouldn't allow players full freedom of movement in that 3D space. Instead, levels would be designed to allow players to only move in 2 dimensions at any point in time, with various paths through each level winding into and out of a level's broader game world, creating the sensation that you'd be exploring a 3D world, but avoiding the common control mechanics pitfalls that befell earlier 3D titles of the time. The end result would be an experience where movement took place on a 2-dimensional plane, but the world would effectively rotate around you as you moved through a given level. In this way, Mystical Ninja 2 was being designed to be the best of both worlds, a true return to Konami's earlier and well-regarded 2D Goemon titles, while still leveraging the 3D graphics that the Nintendo 64 was built for. Similar to Mystical Ninja, a great deal of focus would be placed on providing high-quality pre-recorded audio, both for various musical numbers as well as for a number of lines of voice-acted dialogue. Though interestingly, the North American and European versions of the game would end up having several of the musical tracks cut prior to release. It's not entirely clear why that was the case, as the Japanese voice acting was left intact, so it doesn't appear to have been a language or translation issue. Regardless, the fact is that some songs from the soundtrack were cut from the non-Japanese versions of the game, making the North American and European versions of the title slightly less full-featured than their Japanese counterpart. Mystical Ninja 2 Starring Goemon, or Goemon's Great Adventure depending on where you lived, would eventually release in late 1998 in Japan, with international versions following in 1999. Upon its release, the game would garner critical praise, as many publications loved the game's graphics, audio, and gameplay, believing that Mystical Ninja 2 was a return to form for the Goemon series, with impressive technical capabilities coupled with outstanding gameplay mechanics and overall design. Many critics were surprised at Konami's decision to eschew the more common 3D world design of other Nintendo 64 titles, instead deciding to focus on making a 2.5D experience that harkened back to the days of 16-bit platformers, a style of game that the N64 was simply not known for. In fact, some reviewers even said that while the game looks more realistic than any 16-bit platformer, It actually played exactly like those classic titles, a strong endorsement of the game's overall quality. While the majority of the critical response was positive, there were some critics who felt that the game might be just a bit too focused on Japanese culture to appeal to a broader international market, with some publications declaring the game to be too quirky and crazy for its own good. I'll relay my own thoughts on the game's design in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, Mystical Ninja 2 wears its Japanese cultural inspirations on its sleeve. Whether that's good or not depends on your personal preference, and like I said, I will let you know what I personally think in a few minutes. Beyond its critical success, Mystical Ninja 2 would perform well commercially, with over 160,000 copies sold worldwide. Despite that success, it would actually end up performing poorer than its immediate predecessor, Mystical Ninja, which had sold over 200,000 copies following its release. From a critical perspective, Mystical Ninja 2 was much more highly regarded than the original Mystical Ninja title, but sales-wise, it would end up with lower overall sales than Goemon's first N64 adventure. Certainly a disappointment for the Konami team. And it would be that disappointment, as well as the continued challenges that localization provided, that would make Mystical Ninja 2 the last Goemon title to ever be released officially outside of Japan, with every subsequent Goemon game, including the N64 Direct sequel, returning to Japanese exclusivity. Over the years following Mystical Ninja 2's release, 16 different Goemon titles would be released in Japan for a wide variety of systems and platforms, including the Nintendo 64, Sony PlayStation, and Game Boy Color, just to name a few. While each title would be distinct and respected in its own right, it would be Goemon's Great Adventure, or Mystical Ninja 2 Starring Goemon, that would define the framework for the franchise moving forward. Even though no further international releases would come from the Goemon series, there was still recognition that Mystical Ninja 2 was a stellar experience, and is a game that players everywhere would certainly enjoy if given the chance. Whether you played it back when it was released, or you're like me and played it 26 years later, the fact is that there is a lot to like about Goemon's Great Adventure, and even more broadly, Goemon as a series would end up being incredibly influential, especially in Japan, where several anime series as well as manga comic books would be created over the years, a testament to the lasting legacy of the folklore surrounding the real Goemon, whomever that man truly was, and the various digital and analog creations that would depict Goemon as one of several different archetypal characters recognized by fans the world over. Nobody may know what kind of person Goemon was in reality, but as a digital incarnation, Goemon and the entire Ganbare Goemon series would prove just how talented Konami staff was at creating worthwhile gaming experiences for players to enjoy. While Goemon may not have as much of a reputation outside of its native Japan, that in no way diminishes the quality of the international Ganbare Goemon releases, most of which are widely considered to be among the better games released for their respective consoles. And that quality, and the real-life legend behind those titles, are certainly worthy of your time and attention, even today. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Mystical Ninja 2 today versus when it was released back in 1998, a good 26 years ago. At its core, Mystical Ninja 2 is a fairly traditional side-scrolling platform title, at least in concept, in that over the course of the game, you'll explore a number of different levels, defeat a ton of different enemies, jump from platform to platform, avoiding obstacles along the way, and mostly move your character along a two-dimensional plane, progressing horizontally and vertically throughout each stage. What makes Mystical Ninja 2 unique, though, are all of the additional features and design decisions that serve to both change up gameplay and push the boundaries of your expectations when you hear the phrase side-scrolling platforming title. Mystical Ninja 2, like most platforming titles, consists of a series of worlds, within which are a set of stages that need to be completed in order to progress further in the game. The interesting thing here is that progression is not necessarily tied to beating levels, though that certainly plays a part in making your way further in the game. Instead, progression here is tied to an item that you can collect called entry passes, which you receive for doing a number of different actions. Beating a level will reward you with an entry pass, as will finding secret exits from stages, completing side quests, and occasionally stumbling upon hidden passes that are simply present within a given stage, often hinted at by some clue provided by a townsperson. All told, there are 44 total entry passes available within the game, though only 30 are required to unlock the final castle in the game, which ultimately means you only need 30 passes to get to the final encounters and beat the big bad boss. Speaking of castles, bosses, encounters, and side quests, it strikes me that there's quite a bit of content to discuss here, so let's start going through each piece of the game in a little bit more detail. First, let's focus on the overall game structure, which, like I said, is set up as a fairly typical set of worlds, each of which contains several stages and areas to explore. Each world will typically have between 3 and 5 normal platforming stages, along with a town to visit, a checkpoint gate to pass through, and a castle to eventually conquer. Each platforming stage is designed as a two-dimensional side-scrolling experience, in that players can only move in one of two dimensions, either up and down or side to side, which serves to keep controls fairly straightforward, allowing you to use either the Nintendo 64 analog stick or its directional pad to control your character. The interesting aspect of each stage, though, is the fact that while you may only move in two dimensions, each stage and all of the characters within each stage are designed as fully three-dimensional objects and environments, meaning the game has depth, even though the platforming stages don't allow you to explore that depth directly. What the game does do, though, is present each platforming stage as a series of separate pathways that may or may not connect with one another, oftentimes providing multiple paths through a given stage, some of which lead to the same standard level exit, while other paths lead to a more hidden exit that rewards you with an entry pass, while also unlocking an overworld connection to a different level that may have been otherwise inaccessible. These paths often take advantage of the three-dimensional design of each stage, with certain passages looping around a stage's environment or allowing you to move further into a given scene, so to speak. While you're not actually moving your character depth-wise into or out of a stage, the fact that individual paths do wind through, in, and out of each level really does impart a sense of scale and depth that would otherwise be missing from the title. And here, the degree of variation in paths through each level is pretty darn diverse, and I can honestly say that the sense of exploration in Mystical Ninja 2 was much higher than most two-dimensional platforming titles, as there were numerous times that I found different sections of a given stage somewhat off the beaten path that eventually led me to some worthwhile discovery, like item power-ups and extra lives, or like I mentioned before, secret exits to other stages. The cool thing here is that despite the three-dimensional design of each level and object in the game, the overall gameplay experience is decidedly two-dimensional, which is a really intriguing mix, especially on the Nintendo 64, which was typically known for its 3D platforming titles like Mario 64, Conker's Bad Fur Day, and Banjo-Kazooie. Mystical Ninja 2 feels cut from a similar cloth, but with more restricted movement, and in a way, despite being a Nintendo 64 title, it kind of feels even more retro as a result. That's not to say that the game doesn't have modern for the time design sensibilities, it's just that the side-scrolling platformer was not a common game style on the Nintendo 64, and it makes Mystical Ninja 2 feel decidedly different from most N64 titles. Also making the game feel different than many platformers is the fact that the game uses more direct combat than most platforming games. In Mystical Ninja 2, you can't jump on enemies' heads to defeat them, because that'll actually cause you to take damage. Instead, your character has a weapon at his or her disposal, and you use that weapon to bash or slice your way to victory. What's interesting here is that there is actually an upgrade system in the game for weapons, where if you find a certain power-up, either by defeating enemies or by simply finding it in a stage, you can improve your weapon significantly. You can stack 2 upgrades on your base weapon, and each level of upgrade improves your weapon attack distance as well as the amount of damage it can dish out, and the effect here is pretty darn noticeable. Unfortunately, those upgrades are not permanent, and if you get hit by an enemy without having any shield points, you'll end up dropping down a weapon upgrade level, which can sting a bit depending on what enemies you're in the process of fighting, since certain bad guys might be killable with a single swing of your top tier upgraded weapon, but might require 2 swings of your lower level upgrade, or even potentially 3 swings with no upgrade in place. That is a pretty big gap in damage output, and the same kind of disparity applies to boss fights, who typically have large health pools that can take some time to defeat if you have no weapon upgrades available to you. The bottom line is, weapon upgrades are great. Not having weapon upgrades makes things much more challenging. At this point, we should probably talk about hit points and shield points, because that's your primary means of survival as you play Mystical Ninja 2. By default, you'll begin the game with 3 hit points, and these hit points get depleted whenever you're attacked by an enemy. Luckily, you can find health replenishment items in stages, and dropped by some defeated enemies, so you can usually keep your health topped up without too much issue. You can also buy health replenishing food from towns, by the way, but we'll save that discussion until we dive a bit deeper into the town mechanics in the game. Anyway, in addition to hit points, you also have shield points, and similar to your hit points, you can acquire up to 3 shield points through buying various armor types from in-game vendors. These shield points are incredibly useful, as like I mentioned, you don't lose a weapon upgrade level if you're hit while you have shields equipped. They don't do anything to prevent death if you fall off a cliff, but they do a great job of keeping you alive against martial damage. Beyond the traditional hit points and shield points, the game also offers a series of resurrection items as well, which depending on the quality of the item you have equipped, will either bring you back to life with 1, 2, or 3 hit points restored. These resurrection items, once again, will not save you from a falling death, but any other defeat that occurs on solid ground is completely avoidable with one of these items equipped, which is definitely useful. Before we move on, I should mention one other item about the overall level design, and that is the fact that the game has a day and night cycle, and actually, that day-night cycle is pervasive across the game, not just in platforming stages. The interesting thing here is that there are different enemies and quests that only become available at night, and oftentimes the enemies you encounter at night are a good deal tougher than their daytime equivalents. I greatly enjoyed this aspect of the game, as it really does feel like the danger ramps up, and Mystical Ninja 2 does a great job of shifting between day and night and back again. As night begins to fall, the normal daytime music starts to slow down, and eventually morphs into a much more spooky track, while the enemies themselves morph into their nighttime equivalents. Going back to daytime is the exact opposite effect, where the music speeds back up and sounds cheerier, which after dealing with any nighttime challenges, is certainly a reprieve. It is a really cool mechanic, and one that I wish was implemented in more titles, especially with how well Mystical Ninja 2 handles its internal day-night cycle. Beyond the difficulty of the enemies you face during the night, those enemies also drop more coins than enemies defeated during the day, which means that farming for coins is usually much quicker to do at night. And speaking of coins, unlike games like Mario, coins in Mystical Ninja 2 serve a few different purposes. For one, they can be used to buy items from different shops across the various towns you'll visit, like the previously mentioned health restoration, shielding, and resurrection items. Secondly, coins are the basis for several quests you'll find throughout your playthrough, most typically representing a debt of some sort that you need to pay off. And finally, coins can be used for each character's special maneuvers, such as Goemon's throwing coin attack or Sasuke's bomb attacks. And yes, I probably should have mentioned this already, but there are different characters you gain access to as you play the game, and each one has certain strengths and weaknesses that you'll need to either exploit or overcome. From my perspective, Goemon is by far the best character in the game, and for one primary reason. He is the only character that can double jump. I'll talk more about the game's jump mechanics a little bit later, but I've got to say that generally speaking, I found the jump mechanics in the game to be a bit hit or miss for me, and I often had difficulty landing jumps successfully from one platform to another using any character other than Goemon, as each other character's jumps felt too short to be really effective. Goemon's double jump solves that issue, while also giving him a unique movement mechanic that can allow you to reach otherwise unreachable paths. Sasuke is a much more nimble character than Goemon and has access to a small sword and throwing dagger once his weapons are upgraded. He can't double jump, but he can swim underwater, and he also has access to bombs which, like Goemon's double jump, can allow you to reach areas of stages that are otherwise blocked off. Yae is another nimble character who also uses a sword, and whose primary claim to fame is the fact that she too can swim underwater, though unlike Sasuke, she turns into a mermaid with entirely new attacks for players to use as they're swimming around, one of which is a shooting move while the other is a dash forward kind of attack. Other than getting through water levels, which I will say is not my favorite aspect of the game, I really didn't use Yae all that much, as I found her base moveset to be less useful than most other characters, and certainly not good enough to offset the utility of Goemon's double jump move. And finally, you have Ebisumaru, who I honestly only played a couple times through my whole playthrough. He may be good, and his megaphone maneuver, which allows you to create freestanding platforms, sounds interesting, but I never really spent any time playing as him, other than, like I said, where required by a quest or otherwise insurmountable obstacle. For the most part, Goemon was my main, and I pretty much used him any chance I got. Despite my strong preference for Goemon though, I appreciated that the game included extra characters to play as, and because each character had unique skills, there were certain sections of different levels that could only be accessed by using specific characters. Some of those sections may lead to additional secrets, like I mentioned earlier, while others might simply be an alternate path to travel down before ultimately ending at the same place as other pathways. Regardless of where you end up, I loved the diversity in gameplay that each character offered, and while I played as Goemon for the vast majority of my playtime, I can see the merits of each character, even if I personally think Goemon's double jump far outclasses any benefit that other characters might bring to the team. Shifting our attention a bit from the platforming levels and the experience you get playing those levels, let's talk about the towns in the game. Each world has at least one town to explore, and they effectively serve as a safe haven to buy health and shielding-based items, progress the game's underlying story, and acquire various side quests to complete, most of which will reward you with an entry pass. We already talked a bit about the shops in the towns, but what I haven't mentioned so far is that the towns are the only spots in the game that allow you to explore, fairly freely, the 3D environment that is otherwise relegated to background visuals. In towns, you are not restricted to only moving left and right, and you can walk around the entire area in all 3 dimensions, similar to more modern 3D platforming titles like Super Mario 3D World. The towns in Mystical Ninja 2 never quite reach the extent of a full 3D world because they're not that expansive, but exploring towns is still an interesting change of pace, especially considering the control and perspective restrictions prevalent throughout the rest of the game. Anyway, beyond shops, there are also a couple of other utility functions available in towns, one of which is the inn system, which is where you can save your game, assuming you're not using save states via emulation. And actually, just a quick word about saving in the game and general progression status. Mystical Ninja 2 is a surprisingly forgiving game when it comes to overall progression and maintaining that progression without making players repeat previous content. Every time you exit a stage, whether via beating the level or simply leaving it to return to the overworld map, the game creates a checkpoint of your progress. If you end up losing all of your lives, the game gives you unlimited continues to resume your adventure, placing you right at the point of the last level you entered. You do need to make sure you save your progress at an inn prior to turning off your console, which requires a controller pack, otherwise you'll lose any progress you've made after your last manual save. But while you're playing the game, the act of continuing and maintaining forward progress is pretty darn kind to the player. Another utility function available in the towns is the tea house, which allows you to swap between the 4 characters you have access to. The only time I swapped characters in town was when I needed a certain character to complete an in-town quest, as most of the time there are character swap pads available in levels themselves whenever there's a spot that might require one character over another. I did appreciate the ability to swap characters in town, I just didn't use that functionality all that much in my playthrough. The other reason towns are important, though, is the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, towns are the main areas where you can pick up side quests, which often take the form of a request from a townsperson that requires you to re-enter a previously beaten level, albeit with a set of victory conditions to modify your goals for that level. This might be something as simple as killing a certain number of a specific enemy or racing a non-player character through a certain section of a stage, and in nearly all instances, these side quests provide a nice change of pace from the traditional platforming action that you'll face throughout the majority of your journey. The other thing to realize about side quests is that they almost always reward you with an entry pass, and in order to acquire enough passes to beat the game, you will need to complete at least several side quests, as simply beating levels will not give you the number of entry passes you need to progress through the various checkpoints embedded throughout each world. And speaking of checkpoints, you may have surmised that checkpoints are the main gates that prevent progression, unless you have a certain number of entry passes, and in this case, you would be right. Each world has a checkpoint, and each checkpoint has a certain threshold number of entry passes that you need to acquire before you can pass through to the world's castle. For the most part, simply playing the game and completing side quests you may find will give you plenty of entry passes to progress through the game, though I know that I personally was one entry pass short at the time I reached the final castle of the game, which required me to find another side quest before I could progress to the final stage. This wasn't a huge deal, and overall progressing through the game felt super smooth without the need to grind for passes much, if at all. I also found it interesting that progression was tied to these passes and not simply beating levels, as it encouraged me to really explore the whole game, even content that would technically be considered optional, which I know some players may otherwise decide to skip. Something that's not optional though are the castles in each world, which represent the final stage in each world. The castles, generally speaking, are a big jump in difficulty in comparison to the platforming levels that precede them, with multiple sections that throw pretty much every mechanic and enemy you may have encountered in that world's stages at you. There are 5 castles overall in the game, and the earlier ones are nicely challenging, but still pretty simple for anyone who's played some platforming titles before. The 5th and final castle though? Whoa, hold the phone. Huge difficulty spike, and something that presents a very challenging experience that will likely take numerous tries to complete. I had to actually farm lives in order to get past that stage, simply because it was so difficult. The final castle encompasses enemies and level obstacles from every world that preceded it, which means it is both longer than other castles, and is truly the culmination of everything you've experienced in the game. The development team took those experiences and turned the difficulty up even higher, creating an experience that, unlike pretty much anything else in the game, borders on frustrating at times. The rest of the game has challenging sections, but nothing too crazy. That final castle? I admit to getting a bit angry at that one. Anyway, the general structure of each castle is essentially the same. You work your way through a series of platforming sections that are more difficult, though still representative of the world you're currently in, which is followed up by a boss fight of some sort. Assuming you beat the boss of the castle, you're then dropped into a mega robot fight, which is effectively the final fight for each castle in the game, aside from the final stage. These robot fights are super interesting in their own right, so let's talk about them a little bit. The main focus of these encounters is to control a robot, and beat the snot out of an opposing robot using a combination of moves, blocks, and well-timed shifts in perspective in order to defeat your opponent before they can defeat you. The game provides you with a number of combo moves you can execute while in robot form, most of which do fairly significant damage to your opponent. Sometimes though, your opponent will begin executing an unblockable move, which will absolutely wreak havoc on your hit points. Luckily, you're not the only robot fighting the big bad boss, as you're accompanied by a second robot that you can toss a baton to, effectively switching control to that companion robot. This is incredibly useful, as it keeps you alive and in the fight, and also interrupts any unblockable or high damaging move from your opponent, and each robot that you can control has a separate health pool, so you pretty much have 2 lives, so to speak, to beat each big bad robot boss. My only real critique here is the fact that the baton throw to change robots can sometimes be inaccurate, or your robot companion might be knocked to the ground by the enemy you're fighting, which might make a given baton throw do absolutely nothing. The robot fights in general aren't too challenging, so this doesn't end up being a huge deal at the end of the day, but it was something I noticed while playing through the game, and I would be lying if I didn't at least mention that the baton passing mechanic is a bit more cumbersome than it likely needed to be. Before we continue, I should also mention that the game can be played cooperatively with friends, both in a standard 2-player mode and, assuming you find all 44 entry passes in the game, as an unlockable 4-player experience that I've got to assume is super fun to play. I didn't have a chance to play the game with anyone else, so my impressions are solely from playing the title as a single player. But I will say, the multiplayer actually looks pretty darn fun based on some of the gameplay videos I looked up. The single-player mode itself is an entirely worthwhile experience too, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the local co-op experience that used to be prevalent in nearly any multiplayer game released up through the early 2000s. I know some games still provide local co-op, and anytime I find a game that supports it, I automatically respect that game's developers more. I know this is purely nostalgia-fueled, but I don't care. Some of my fondest memories are of sitting in front of my television as a child playing games with my brother. I wish I was able to recreate that experience with Mystical Ninja 2 today, but unfortunately, that just wasn't in the cards for this episode. Anyway, multiplayer musings aside, all of the different gameplay mechanics and design decisions we've discussed ultimately combine together into a game that is unique, quirky, and above all else, fun. And that's not even considering other aspects of the game that serve to increase your overall enjoyment of the title. We're going to talk about those more specific aspects of the game in just a minute. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at, where we didn't have a pervasive internet with YouTube and gameplay videos at our disposal. A lot of times when we made a buying decision, it was based on what the box looked like. We made that buying decision in the store itself. We take a look at the store shelves. Did we find a box that looked cool? If so, we might pick it up, flip it over, look at the back of the box. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might buy it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Mystical Ninja 2 starring Goemon, or Goemon's Great Adventure for the Nintendo 64, the back of the box says, Goemon and all his friends are back in his greatest adventure yet. Goemon's Great Adventure combines classic Goemon platform action with an all-new twist. The evil time-traveling nun Bismaru has summoned Dochuki, a demon prince, to take over the Earth. But first, she wants to marry him. Can Goemon and his gang stop this demon? Can Dochuki escape the cloying clutches of the whacked-out nun? Will Abisu ever beat his own dumpling-eating record? It's an adventure you'll never forget. Multiple paths within each level. 5 different areas with multiple stages in each area. Subquests to unravel. 4 different characters, each with unique abilities. 2-player cooperative play. 2-player tag team super robot battles. New 2-player piggyback attack. Team up with a friend to take on the Demon Prince's minions. And special skills like Poison Mist and Solid Megaphone. Attack the enemies with Abisu's tone-deaf singing. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box that show action of the in-game gameplay. And I've got to say, yeah, this one sells me. This box is actually pretty darn good. I enjoyed the fact that it felt kind of a little tongue-in-cheek, not so serious. It got the point across as far as what the game actually was. The graphics in the screenshots look pretty darn good. This felt like a light-hearted platforming kind of game. And for the Nintendo 64, like I said, because it was focused primarily, or at least a lot of their titles were on 3D platforming instead of 2D platforming, this one would have sold me. The screenshots even make it look like there's a 3D element there, but it's not necessarily that traditional, almost pseudo tilted over the shoulder kind of view that a lot of the N64 3D platformers had. So yes, this box absolutely sold me. I did not own this game back when it came out, but looking at the box now, it's one I kind of wish that I had purchased back then. Anyway, we're going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Mystical Ninja 2 are pretty darn great, with well-designed environments and characters that have a fair amount of detail in their texture work and general visual design, especially for a Nintendo 64 era title. While the game is fully rendered and designed using 3D objects and polygons, it never falls into the trap of many 3D platforming titles, where you can very clearly see the polygons that make up every character, object, and level. The forced 2D perspective prevalent throughout the title actually helps here, as it prevents players from navigating spaces and viewing scenes using alternate angles that can sometimes expose unintended flaws. And while I'm not 100% sure that was intended by the design team, it certainly helped to make the game feel more well-designed than many of its peers. If I wanted to be picky, I could mention that, despite that forced 2D perspective, many of the character graphics contain very angular features, which makes characters look like they originated from an earlier era of 3D gaming, which of course they did. But I honestly didn't have an issue here, as the graphics still looked pretty darn good, and unless you personally have a serious issue with late 90s styled graphics, I can't imagine anyone will have an issue with the visuals in the game. Moving beyond the technical aspects of the title, I have to mention the overall graphic style, which is 100% Japanese-centric, and I have to say, I loved the overall visual aesthetic in the game. Everything you experience, every enemy, every character, every environment, just screams, this was lovingly made in Japan, and I was here for it. There were a number of cultural references embedded throughout the game, like the demon-like Tengu creatures inhabiting certain sections of the game, or the Oni that, for some reason, really like hula hooping. And you know what? Okay, we need to talk about those hula hooping Oni, because I've got questions. When you lose all your lives, you're presented with a continue screen featuring 3 Oni who will hula hoop faster and faster, assuming you choose to continue the game. But those Oni, rather than simply being Japanese mythological figures, are clad in the equivalent of Speedo briefs, with nothing else left to the imagination. My primary question is, why? I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but it felt so quirky and so decidedly Japanese that I couldn't help but love it. Anyway, the game is very much a Japanese title, and for those of you who appreciate seeing different cultural references, environments, and characters, you will find a lot to like here. Animations, meanwhile, are all super smooth, and the act of moving your character and reacting to enemies in the game world all feel great and look expertly designed. I was seriously impressed by the animations in the title, and even further, the overall visual presentation really worked for me. 2 thumbs way up as it relates to the graphics in Mystical Ninja 2. Moving on to the sound and music, if I had more than 2 thumbs to give, the sound and music in the game would get all of them, because the music is simply outstanding. There's an amazing mix of what appears to be sampled traditional Japanese instruments combined with N64 synthesized instruments that creates a soundscape that feels much more advanced and higher quality than most other Nintendo 64 titles I've experienced. The overall quality actually approached CD audio standards, meaning the soundtrack sounded real, not synthesized, and it's a testament to the work of both the game's composer and sound designers that Mystical Ninja 2 sounds as good as it does. This is another area, by the way, that really illustrates the Japanese origins of the title, and I loved every second of it. I really enjoy listening to other cultures' music, so a game like this is pretty much tailor-made for me to enjoy. But honestly, I believe that nearly everyone will end up enjoying Mystical Ninja 2's soundtrack. The sound effects, meanwhile, all sound great and match perfectly with the action playing out on the screen, while the voice acting that's included, which is limited to only certain cutscenes, is actually really good. Now, I admit that I don't speak Japanese, so I had to rely on the subtitles exclusively, but there were a couple aspects of the voice acting that I feel we need to talk about. First is the sheer quality of the voice work itself, which legitimately sounded like it could have belonged to an anime show or movie. I don't watch a lot of anime like I've mentioned, but I've seen enough to know what anime sounds like, and Mystical Ninja 2 sounds exactly like that, which once again really demonstrates how much of Japan's culture is included in the game. The second aspect of the voice acting that I should mention is the technical quality of the voice recordings, which sounded super clear and unlike anything I expected to emanate from a Nintendo 64 cartridge. As I believe most are aware, the cartridge format, typically speaking, pales in comparison to CD-ROM technology from a storage perspective, which means high-quality audio and video was typically the domain of CD-based consoles rather than cartridge-driven systems. The Nintendo 64, more than any other cartridge-based console, provided additional storage for developers to include higher quality audio than prior cartridge systems, and some companies like Rare used that storage to great effect in games like Conker's Bad Fur Day, where they were able to use MP3 compression to deliver musical tracks that approached CD quality audio. Even with that musical quality though, the voice work in Conker, as well as pretty much every other N64 game I've played, usually sounds partially compressed due to the desire to keep storage down. With Mystical Ninja 2, the voice work sounded exceedingly clear, and I know that's a weird thing to spend so much time talking about, but it seriously shocked me just how clear the voice work was. I don't know what specific techniques the team used to record the audio, and I don't know if they ended up compressing the voice tracks or if the limited number of spoken lines let them keep the audio uncompressed, but regardless, it sounded really good, and from my perspective, almost sounded like what you would get with a high-quality CD-based game. It was legitimately that good. Overall, the audio in Mystical Ninja 2 is as close to perfect as you can get, and I loved every moment my ears spent listening to the game. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Mystical Ninja 2, you control one of 4 characters on a quest to stop the descendant of one of your allies, Bismaru, from unleashing a somewhat unnatural disaster upon the world. Specifically, the creation of an undead army in support of her master, the evil demon Dochuki. Bismaru ends up capturing an invention that had been created by an old wise man, a ghost return machine as the game calls it, and with that stolen invention, Bismaru sets out to resurrect a ton of skeletons, spirits, demons, and ghosts, all in the hopes of conquering the world and preparing it for the arrival of Dochuki. Luckily for the world, you, Goemon, and your 3 other allies, Ibisumaru, Sasuke, and Yae, along with your trusty robot, Impact, and other companions you meet throughout the world, set out to band together and push back the evil menace. And, hopefully, defeat Dochuki and his minions once and for all. So this story, I honestly don't know exactly what was happening here, as it was, once again, very Japanese, and it felt like there were a good number of recurring characters that I personally had no familiarity with, having not played the other games in the series. I mean, sure, I get it, the story boils down to stop bad guy with the help of friends, so it's not like it's indecipherable. It just felt like I had sat down to watch a movie sequel without seeing the original film. I was kinda lost, didn't know who anyone was, but you know what? I still enjoyed the content for its standalone value. I don't mean this as a true critique of the game, because I think the story, taken at face value, was fine. I just kinda wish I knew more about the lore and backstory of the game's world and its characters, which would have likely improved my enjoyment of the story even more. Like I said, I'm not holding my lack of playing prior titles against it. It's just something to note that if you do decide to play Mystical Ninja 2 without having experienced prior Goemon adventures, you might feel a little bit lost. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked at great length about the overall structure and general controls for the game, so we're not going to talk about all that stuff here again. What I do want to talk about, though, is just how good the controls feel, because this is one responsive, well-designed game from a controls perspective. I always felt in control of my character when moving around and attacking enemies, though there is one aspect of the controls that I felt could have been tweaked a bit, and that is the jump mechanics, which I talked about briefly earlier. Other than Goemon, whose double jump made for fairly easy platforming, I really didn't find much platforming success when using anyone with a single limited jump maneuver. I'm not sure if this was an issue with me or the game, but there were a number of times when I would misjudge the distance of a jump, only to fall to my death as my feet scraped across the ledge I was trying to jump towards. I will readily admit that the jumping in this game did take me a little bit to get used to, as even in the earlier stages, I had some difficulty maneuvering Goemon around until I became more familiar with the jump physics and distances, so it's entirely possible my issue with other characters was truly a me problem. But what I will say is that I did eventually become used to the game's jump mechanics, at least as Goemon, and once I did, the game's platforming sections felt pretty good to play. Not perfect, mind you, but definitely a quality experience. From an overall playability perspective, the game was, for the most part, an accessible experience that almost anyone should be able to have some fun with, though I do need to once again reiterate that there are some challenging sections interspersed throughout the game, which can occasionally act as difficulty spikes in an otherwise smooth experience. The biggest culprit here is by far the final castle, which is super difficult, especially in comparison to every level that came before it. But there were also some other stages and castles that were a bit more challenging than their surrounding levels. Nothing here was hard enough to slow me down for too long, aside from the last castle, but if you're the kind of gamer who wants a 100% easy-breezy platforming experience, Mystical Ninja 2 isn't quite it. If you're looking for a mostly balanced challenge though, I think you'll find a lot to like in Goemon's Great Adventure. Mystical Ninja 2, at the end of the day, felt like taking a trip to Japan, where everyone you meet is an exaggerated anime character, and everywhere you walk has nods to Japanese culture, and everything you look at has an excessive amount of quirky charm that you can't help but love. I never expected to like Mystical Ninja 2 as much as I did. I mean, it's not like I expected it to be a bad game, because I was aware of its reputation, it's just that I didn't think my expectations would be so far exceeded. I fell in love with Mystical Ninja 2 as I played it, and despite the somewhat uneven difficulty in the final castle, and certain segments of different levels, I still played the entire game with a smile on my face. The title exudes charm at every turn, and I can't imagine someone sitting down to play this game and not immediately becoming enamored with the unique combination of action platform gameplay elements and Japanese cultural references. It is, to put it simply, a great game. So what is our verdict on Mystical Ninja 2? Well, it probably goes without saying at this point, but Mystical Ninja 2, or Goemon's Great Adventure, depending on where you're from, is absolutely a no-brainer inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. It is charming, it is well-designed, it looks great, it sounds remarkable, and it is, above all, fun. I can't say enough good things about Mystical Ninja 2, and my only regret is that I didn't play prior titles first so that I could have a better appreciation of the game's story, lore, and characters. I don't think that's a prerequisite to enjoy the experience, as my own playthrough demonstrates, but I feel like it would have been even better if I had some additional context. Regardless, Goemon's Great Adventure is an absolutely phenomenal game, and as such, it has undeniably earned its spot as the newest addition to our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Mystical Ninja 2 starring Goemon. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on the classic CDI title, Link: The Faces of Evil. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I am hitting the mark with the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to build our community and continue to deliver the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Link, the Faces of Evil. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.